Hey, it's Ramsey Dewey over here in Shanghai, China. Welcome to another edition of Q&A with the Coach. We have a question from There Are No Available Names. Really? Come on, man. You can be more creative than that. There are available screen names. Look into it. You could try There Are No Available Names 001 or something like that. Come on, man. Use some creativity. Anyway, he says, did you see Justin Thornton that died after a fight with the organization Bare Knuckle Fighting Championship? What are your thoughts on the organization and bare knuckle in general? Yes, I did hear about that. I saw the fight. If you didn't, I'm not going to replay it here, but it was short, very short, like about half a minute long or so. And Justin, he's an MMA fighter, trying out this bare knuckle boxing thing. He's trying to press the action, bridge the gap. His opponent is making some space and hitting him on the way in. Clips him with a hook, I think it was a right hook, that dropped Justin. Down he went. The death didn't happen immediately. It happened, I believe, 6 weeks after the fight. Justin was rendered partially paralyzed after this knockout, and 6 weeks later passed away. May he rest in peace. It's a very unfortunate story. And I absolutely hate to hear about fighters dying as a result of fighting. But man, it is something that does happen. It has happened. It will probably continue to happen, unfortunately. Fighting is an inherently dangerous sport. Man, I remember before my first pro fight, something that kind of shook me a little bit was a little bit of a sobering reality. The fight promoter came up to all the fighters with a camera in hand and read a statement saying, do you acknowledge that fighting is an inherently dangerous sport which may result in serious injury or death? And before we were allowed to fight, before we were allowed to take one step further into this process, we had to say, yes, I acknowledge this on camera. And it's a legal precaution. Yeah, it's a legal precaution. We had to sign a document, of course, but they wanted to get it on film. And that's important for a fighter to verbally acknowledge, as well as just writing it on. It's easy to just sign your name away on a bunch of documents without reading the fine print. And the fine print in these contracts essentially says, if you die, we're not responsible. You acknowledge that this is a dangerous thing. How many times have you clicked a user agreement for a piece of software or a website or an app with 20 pages of fine text you never bothered to read? And now you got all kinds of crazy spyware on your phone or your computer or who knows what you signed your life away. You don't even know. And you don't even care. Because it probably doesn't affect you on a macroscopic scale. But when it's spelled out to you in plain, simple English in your ear and you have to verbally admit it, fighting is an inherently dangerous sport, which may result in serious injury or death. And you're like, yes, I acknowledge that. Man, that just starts to make it real. About the Bare Knuckle Fighting Championship, I mentioned this a couple of times. My first observation when I first saw the fights in the show was that there were unwraps, which kind of defeats the purpose of bare knuckle, in my opinion. I assume the reason they were doing that is because whatever athletic commission oversees this said, well, at least have the wraps on to protect the hands of the fighters. But the problem with that is the wraps allow you to punch a lot harder than you would naturally be able to do without the wraps on. It locks all these little bones into place and turns them into rocks. So a bare knuckle fight, man, that just turns into throwing rocks at each other's heads, basically, if your hands are wrapped up. If your hands are not wrapped up, it's more like throwing beanbags at each other's heads, throwing sacks of marbles at each other's heads. That can hurt, can even knock you out, but it's not going to have the same level of damage. So I watched a few of these bare knuckle fights, and I noticed something. A lot of the fighters went into these fights with the same gusto as gloved up boxing. And one of the big differences between gloved up boxing and old school bare knuckle boxing without the wraps, empty-handed boxing, I should call it, is that in the empty-handed boxing days, they were really, really careful about placing the punches. There was a lot of hand fighting, there was a lot of clinching, a lot of grappling, trying to find that perfect spot to land the punch without breaking your hands. And they added gloves to protect the fighter's hands so they could punch more recklessly, more often, make the fights more exciting, and transversely much more dangerous. And of course the wraps underneath the tape, the gauze, all that stuff to make your hands hard so they don't break, because fighters with broken hands tend to give you some boring fights. And boring fights don't sell as many tickets, don't make as much money. I would love to see a Bare Knuckle Fighting Championship without the wraps. That would be interesting. That would be truly educational, I think. That would answer a lot of questions, and I think it would be a lot less dangerous. Yeah, initially people would go out there and they would try to box like gloved up boxing. They would try to throw reckless combinations and knock the other guy out quick. And they would break their hands along the way, and they would shorten their careers. But in the long term, you'd have fighters learning to fight more intelligently. And more safely, if you will. So what exactly happened to Justin? I've seen a bunch of people making videos about this. I looked into his career. Unfortunately, the late Justin Thornton, he'd been knocked out a bunch of times. He went into that fight with cumulative damage. Doesn't take a genius to figure this out. He had a bunch of cumulative damage on the brain from previous fights, previous concussions, etc. And, that simple right hook that a lot of otherwise healthy fighters could have walked away from turned into a catastrophic event. And people want to point fingers and say it's his fault, it's his fault, it's her fault. It's the fault of the rules, it's the fault of the evil bare knuckles, it's the fight game, man. Fighters are just too tough for their own good. Too tough to say no when they probably should sometimes. Thanks for watching. Now get out there and train.